You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 26th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, Antony Blinken is heading to the ASEAN summit today. We'll look at the priorities on the agenda. Then Venezuela goes to the polls on Sunday. The opposition is way ahead, but will the election be free and fair? Plus,
7,000 athletes, 94 boats, and at least 3,000 dancers. All eyes are set on tonight's opening ceremony for the 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Paris.
Our live coverage from Paris begins. We'll have a flick through the front pages, find out how Brazil is encouraging retirees to travel, and then...
We did not, if we're honest, learn whether there was any truth to the rumours that Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump was already wearying of his recently anointed mini-me, but we are choosing to believe them because it amuses us so to do.
Andrew Mueller looks back at the week. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. US Vice President Kamala Harris has pressured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to help reach a Gaza ceasefire deal, raising the question of whether she would be more aggressive in dealing with him than President Biden if she is elected. Mexican drug kingpin Ishmael El Mayo Zambado and the son of his ex-partner Joaquim El Chapo Guzman have been arrested in Texas. And Sri Lanka will vote to elect a new president in September, a crucial contest that's expected to determine the future of reforms in the island nation. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has started on a six-nation tour of Asia, which should have begun with the funeral of the late communist leader Nguyen Phu Trong. He's missed that now because he delayed the start of the trip to accommodate Netanyahu's visit to Washington. Blinken's trip includes a stop in Laos, where he's participating in the meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. Well, I'm joined now by Bill Hayton, who's an Associate Fellow at Chatham House's Asia-Pacific programme and the author of A Brief History of Vietnam. Bill, good to have you back with us. How significant is it that Blinken was planning to attend this funeral? I mean, what does it tell us about the changing nature of the US's relationship with Vietnam?
I think it shows that the US is working quite hard to try to keep Vietnam not necessarily on its side, but at least from drifting too close to China. There's been quite a lot of turmoil in the top leadership of Vietnam in the last few months. And the guy who seems to have won the power struggle is much more sort of authoritarian-minded. And I suspect he will be much more comfortable dealing with China than dealing with a US that sort of talks about democracy and pluralism and that kind of thing. So I think this is a very quick way for the US to try to familiarise themselves with the new guy who's running the show, and to try and work out kind of where the land lies going forward.
Now, Blinken's also joining the ASEAN meeting in Laos, as are the foreign ministers of both Russia and Japan. I understand one of the main issues will be the increasingly violent situation in Myanmar, and I wondered if you could bring us up to speed about what's happening there recently.
Well, it's very, very chaotic. Something like 5,500 people have been killed since the coup. Something like 3 million people have been displaced from their homes. These are obviously sort of estimates because it's very difficult to get good, accurate reporting from Myanmar. You've got a Myanmar military which is still strong, but is increasingly challenged in the sort of mountainous upland areas around its sort of main ethnic Bamar heartland, if you like. You've got militias associated with the different ethnic groups, on the country's borders, increasingly well-armed and organised, and the country itself sort of languishing but not able to go forward. So, yeah, and it's, with its reputation for being a place where drugs are produced, where people go to emigrate from. It worries Southeast Asian countries because they fear the spillover from the war coming across their borders.
And in fact, they have a 5-point consensus for peace, but they're struggling to implement it. What is the broad outline of that?
Well, it's been around for 2 years, just over 2 years now, and it's supposed to be a framework through which the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, will mediate some kind of way forward and alleviate the suffering of the people. But the problem is that the military junta in Myanmar have basically said, thanks very much, we'll ignore that. And that's left ASEAN really without any means of getting involved. And so individual members of ASEAN, Thailand and Indonesia in particular, have taken it upon themselves to try to intervene. And that's left the organisation weak and directionless when it comes to Myanmar. So it's a major problem for ASEAN as to how to deal with this. But they're wary of intervening in one country's internal affairs for fear that it creates a precedent for ASEAN to intervene more widely. So ASEAN, I think the individual governments know that they have to do something, but there are odds as to exactly what they do.
Now, the tensions in the South China Sea will undoubtedly come up. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, they're all locked in maritime disputes with China over its claim of sovereignty over virtually all of the South China Sea. The Philippines and China say that they've reached an agreement over the second Thomas Shoal, though. I mean, does that give us hope that China might be changing its attitude?
No, I don't think so. I mean, China takes the view that pretty much everything within its U-shaped line that appears on its maps belongs to China, and so any agreement is merely a kind of a pause. I think this has been a place. It's the second Thomas Shoal. I mean, it's a tiny coral reef upon which the Philippines rammed a ship back in 1999 and has stationed 5 or 6 Marines there ever since, resupplying them and changing the personnel from time to time. But it really wants to repair this ship because it's literally rusting away. And China wants to stop the Philippines doing that because it basically wants the reef to be unoccupied. And I suspect that China would then try and occupy the reef once the Philippines had left. So any agreement is really just a sort of, I think, a cosmetic deal. And I think the US has been very keen to reinforce the Philippines' diplomatic efforts on this. The Philippines and the US have a mutual defense treaty, and the US has made clear that any attack on a Philippines Coast Guard or Navy ship could be grounds to invoke this mutual defense treaty. So you have this bizarre situation where, in theory, the US and China could go to war over this tiny little coral reef. So both sides, all sides, are keen to avoid that. So
ASEAN has been working with China to produce a sort of South China Sea code of conduct. Can you tell us more?
Well, they've been trying to do this for more than a quarter of a century, so I don't have any great hopes that it's going to be agreed at this coming meeting. They keep on. Everybody thinks it's a good idea, at least in principle. But when it comes down to the detail, Vietnam wants it to include a set of islands called the Paracels. Philippines wants it to include a reef called the Scarborough Shoal. China says no. China wants to have a veto on the other countries having military exercises with countries from outside the region, like the US or Australia or Japan or China. The Southeast Asian countries say no. So I see yet more sort of going round and round and round the houses on this, and maybe some sort of piece of paper with a new name, but unfortunately it won't be a code of conduct, I don't think.
I mean, in terms of balance of power, many of these countries are reliant on China economically. How does that influence the way that this issue about the South China Sea is approached?
Well, I think the Southeast Asians are quite good at compartmentalising their disputes and trying to keep that separate from the overall trade relationship with China, which is huge. I mean, China is, it's a massive trade surplus with Southeast Asia, but the Southeast Asians depend a lot on this trade and on Chinese investment and investment in infrastructure and other things like that. So they have to try and keep themselves balanced. in many ways, they welcome the involvement of the US as a means of, giving them an anchor, which means they don't get sucked too close to China, in the same way that they welcome the involvement of India and Japan and Australia and other countries, and Russia for that matter, in some places. They want to, have their cake and eat it.
You mentioned Russia. Why is Sergei Lavrov there?
Well, ASEAN makes a point of what it's called its centrality and trying to engage all the different powers. There are different views. I mean, Singapore has been very vocal against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Vietnam invited President Putin to go and visit only a few weeks ago. And Laos, I think, would probably take a similar view. And there is, I think, this sense that, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine, Southeast Asia has to stay neutral on the broader sort of balance of power between the big powers, Russia, China, the US. And so it will, for them, it's much more important to engage rather than to impose sanctions as a bloc or refuse to talk to the Russians. I mean, for example, there's the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a much wider group, 27, 28 countries, invites North Korea to come. So this is one of the few meetings where the Americans and the North Koreans, sit at the same meeting.
Just finally, I mean, obviously the US administration have prioritised the region. I wonder what happens under the next administration. Does this suggest a likely continuity in Indo-Pacific policy under a potential Harris presidency, and how might that change if it were a Trump administration?
Well, I think that Blinken will get a lot more attention now, I think, because of Harris entering the race. I think pretty much the whole of Southeast Asia had priced in a Trump victory in November, and they were just sort of, thinking that this is the tail end of the Biden administration and they'll be nice to them and that'll be that. But now I guess they're looking at Washington afresh and thinking, it's possible that Trump won't win, and so maybe we need to kind of, revive our ties with this sort of Democratic administration, and maybe they'll be a little more confident that they won't, be, left on their own. I think they were assuming that if Trump got in, they would be much more America first, that they would be left to, sort out their own defences a bit more. They would be under pressure on trade and that kind of thing. Whereas, maybe with a prospect of a Kamala Harris victory, there'd be a bit more like sort of business as usual, a bit more US engagement. But they'll still be hedging their bets. I mean, they'll be thinking about the worst case scenario and what do we do if Trump wins.
Bill, thank you very much indeed. That's Bill Hayton there, and this is The Globalist. It's 7:13 here in London, and that's 2:13 in Caracas. Venezuela's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro, who's been in power for 11 years, is hoping to win another 6 when the country votes on Sunday. Polls indicate that the opposition candidate, the retired diplomat Edmundo González, should cruise to victory easily. However, there are credible suspicions that the election is nowhere near free and fair, and fears that Maduro will make good on the threat that there will be a bloodbath if he loses. Well, I'm joined now by Andrew Thompson, who's a journalist and a political risk analyst specialising in Latin America. Andrew, good to have you back on the programme. A recent survey showed us that more than 74% of Venezuelans want a change in government. Now, that would normally guarantee a win for the opposition, but these are not normal circumstances. We know that Maduro was narrowly elected in 2013 after the death of his mentor, Hugo Chavez. In 2018, he won again. But that election, the opposition boycotted, saying that conditions weren't free and fair. Well, this time there is a popular opposition candidate standing, but in fact he's a replacement. So can you tell us what happened to the original candidate?
Yes, I think the key context is that the government of Maduro controls pretty much everything. So mounting an opposition challenge is very, very difficult. What happened in this case was that the main opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, won primary elections organized by an opposition coalition last October with an absolutely, with a landslide vote. She got over 90% of the vote in the primaries, and she then started the process for getting registered as a presidential candidate. The electoral court, which is controlled by the government, rejected her, claiming that she had committed various irregularities, one of which was to support the US embargo against Venezuela. So she was directly excluded. At that point, she came up with a proxy, someone who would stand in her place, but that person, Corina Jodis, found that she couldn't actually register on the electoral website that suspiciously seemed to break down every time she tried to register. So she went for a second proxy choice, who's Edmundo González Urrutia, a former ambassador who's kind of representing her. He is the presidential candidate, but he is in a close alliance with her. And the very interesting thing is that this, if you like, accidental, unlikely alliance is actually looking as if it's performing very, very well, better than any other opposition attempts in the past. So there is an important sense of optimism in opposition ranks and a feeling that this time they may be able to win.
How else have the opposition been harassed?
Well, they talk, in Venezuela, they talk of rebanadas, which are sort of slices. The government has, if you like, a policy of slices to try and make it difficult for the opposition. For example, Corina Machado has been traveling around the country. Wherever she goes, roads suddenly get blocked to impede her electioneering activities. Whenever the campaign sort of organization stops at a restaurant, the restaurant is immediately closed because its tax situation is said to be irregular. There are about 7 million Venezuelans outside Venezuela as a result of the long-standing economic and political crisis. And those, technically, theoretically, they can vote from outside the country. But again, all sorts of computer failures and breakdowns and bureaucratic instruments have been used. So hardly any of the overseas Venezuelans will actually be voting in Sunday's elections.
So are there going to be independent or international election monitors?
There are going to be a very few. The European Union Electoral Observation Unit was disinvited by the Venezuelan authorities. There are going to be some representatives of the Carter Center, for example, and a few other United Nations observers, but there's much, much less international observation than was previously expected.
So if Maduro wins against all odds, what options do the opposition have?
If Maduro wins, it means a continuation of the status quo, which is very, very bleak for the opposition because it is constantly being harassed. There are about 300 political prisoners, and all forms of opposition activity are constantly persecuted. A lot depends on, the numbers in the elections. It is likely that Corina Machado will continue trying to keep opposition activity, but it would be a big setback.
And if he loses, would he hand over power?
This is the kind of $64,000 question. Based on past performance, he is unlikely to hand over power unless some kind of a deal is done. And those who take an optimistic view of what the opposition can achieve say that there will have to, if the opposition wins on Sunday, there would then have to be negotiations with the government on the political transition, which would be a long-standing process. You have to bear in mind that a lot of members of the government could potentially face human rights violation charges, criminal investigations because of links to drug cartels and trafficking. So officials in the government potentially have a lot to lose, and therefore you'd be looking at some kind of negotiation that would, to some degree, protect their interests or limit their prosecution or allow them to leave the country. It will be a complicated negotiating process.
And is there likely to be violence, whatever happens?
There is a significant risk of violence. up till now, and by Venezuelan standards, the campaign has been relatively peaceful. But if you have a situation, for example, where the opposition wins and the Maduro government is asked to accept that victory, it's likely that members of the regime will try and campaign and disrupt what goes on. Just to give you an example, Maduro himself has gone on record saying that if we don't win, Venezuela will fall into a bloodbath and a civil war. This led various other Latin American leaders, including the Brazilian president, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, to sort of basically say that this was not the way to do things. I think the phrase he used was, if you win, you stay. If you lose, you go and try another time. So it will be the days and weeks immediately after Sunday's election will be scrutinized very, very closely.
Andrew, thank you. I'm quite sure we'll be joining you again soon to find out what happens there at this weekend's election. That's Andrew Thompson. Still to come on the programme.
Quand il me prend dans ses bras, il me parle tout bas, je vois la vie en rose.
We'll hear which international superstar is rumoured to be performing La Vie en Rose at the opening ceremony of the 2024 Paris Olympic Games later today. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 7:22. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio with me, Georgina Godwin. And we'll continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is the journalist Robin Brandt, who's also the BBC's former China correspondent. Robin, 7 years in China?
7 years, yeah, ending in COVID and a lockdown. But I think we probably touched on that before. Now's not time to go there again.
But during that time, of course, one of the things that you did cover was flooding.
Yeah, and as I kind of try and keep the studio in a healthy state here, yeah, I mean, China has huge issues with climate change and with the impact of extreme weather all over the country. And we are reminded of that today with a warning from Xi Jinping himself, the leader of the Communist Party, the country's president, who has chosen to intervene and warning cadres, that's Communist Party members, of the threat that's coming and the need to kind of pull together in various parts of the country and help prepare for flooding events that are coming and help in the operation to save lives and clean up. Now, look, this is rare because an intervention from Xi Jinping from the very top in itself is quite unusual. But to kind of decode the message here, the message is, look, yet again, it's going to be bad. And China, home to the Yangtze River, gets flooding on a scale that here is almost unimaginable. I covered an event in Henan province, which is the interior in the middle of China back in 2021, which for me was a kind of a microcosm of the problems that China faces. 14 people actually died in a metro system underground. They drowned because the flooding event was so quick and in scale, it was so immense. I, in my reporting, dealt with a lot of hassle from local authorities on the ground because it was a subject of such extreme sensitivity. But two things were highlighted, and that is the fact that China doesn't really have very good civil defence provision to prepare for and deal with the aftermath of events like this. You know, Japan is the world leader in this in terms of what it can do in that part of the world. And the other thing, of course, is part of this is as a result, yes, of climate change, yes, of a country that has to deal with various different weather types, and yes, extreme weather weather events, super typhoons, but also urbanisation. The city that I went to, Jiangsu in Henan, when I covered this flooding, is a wave of concrete expansion, and the ability to deal with floods, the ability to soak up the water, has not met the speed at which these cities have developed, and the speed at which the concrete, frankly, has been applied over a vast scale. So yet again, Xi Jinping warning about these events, but it reminds us of the problems that China face in trying to deal with climate change and trying to deal with extreme weather. At the same time, they're trying to continue to expand its cities and build and build and build, and not have that provision at the same time for dealing with extreme flooding.
And of course, it's not only China. The FT today is talking about heat-related stress for workers in Europe and other parts of Asia.
Yeah, so what's interesting in these figures, and maybe we'll talk a bit as well about the US and its efforts to kind of continue on its trajectory and cutting its carbon emissions, but the numbers from the United Nations and the ILO point to a staggering increase, really, particularly in Europe, of workers exposed to what they call the silent killer of extreme heat. Look, in Africa and in the Middle East and in parts of Asia, large numbers of workers there have always had to deal with the extremities of heat in the workplace there. But what we're seeing over the past 25 years, according to the United Nations, is an increase to around almost 13% of workers on one particular day in July last year in Europe faced the threat of extreme heat. Now, that is a phenomenon that some in various parts of the world are used to dealing with and having to tolerate and mitigate. For those in Europe, particularly in the south of Europe, it is far, far more different. And there are some staggering figures amongst these details from the United Nations. Apparently, 70% of global workers now face having to deal with the prospect of extreme heat. And there are parts of the world, particularly in the Americas, when there's been a huge jump in the impact it's having on workers' ability to work. And of course, the economic impact there is almost kind of immeasurable.
And so do you think that the US's push towards a greener future is on track?
Well, look, you would have thought, wouldn't you? I mean, look, on the one hand, the world's biggest historical polluter. On the other hand, attempting to lead the world diplomatically, certainly the Biden administration anyway, and those just before the Trump administration, in terms of living up to those Paris Accords, to keep the increase in carbon emissions and global temperatures below those 1.5 degree level. We've had the Inflation Reduction Act, a vast amount of investment in green technology in the United States. One figure really stands out in some reporting from the Financial Times this morning. In just the first quarter of this year, the first 3 months of 2024, investment in continental United States in green technologies at $71 billion. I mean, that's the kind of figure that some kind of, financial ministers, particularly here in the UK, would look on with great envy. And yet, the reporting from the Financial Times today says the pace of reduction is not where the US should be in terms of living up to its promises. And in the current trajectory, it will not make its target of a 50% reduction by 2030. And of course, as well, the key thing here is a nod towards the prospect of a Trump administration and a rerun of some of the measures that President Trump Mark II is likely to bring in, which would be almost certainly a withdrawal again from those Paris Accords.
Now, the name on everybody's lips at the moment, Thomas Matthew Crooks. But 43 years ago, it was John Hinckley.
Yeah, now, I think this is a fascinating piece in the New York Times magazine that, for me, looked as though there was a plan to publish it anyway, but rather serendipitously, if that's the right word, coincided with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. Now, John Hinckley, in 1981, attempted to assassinate President Reagan, and he almost did it. He fired 6 bullets outside the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. That's a place I've been to and stood at that place near DuPont Circle. It's eerie in itself. And he nearly did succeed in killing President Reagan. But the most fascinating thing, as we all kind of think a bit more about political assassinations, attempted ones, in terms of what we saw a couple of weeks ago, is John Hinckley is now talking about what he did. He was in jail up until 2016. He left, and only in 2022 were the restrictions fully lifted that now allows him to pursue actually a musical career and also to talk to members of the media. And it is to the New York Times to which he's spoken in a very lengthy piece. And there is the beginnings of an attempt to understand what he did. There was a trial. He was sent to psychiatric hospital. He was acquitted because of diminished responsibility of the attempted murder. But there was a trial in which we had evidence and tried to begin to understand the motivations of what he did. But now we have a piece of journalism, extensive piece of journalism, in which he's interviewed, and the New York Times journalist spends time with him, and they touch on the motivations in his life and what's happened since. And there is some kind of analysis as well of what drives political assassinations, both the attempts and those are successful. And it touches on the death of Yitzhak Rabin and Shinzo Abe in Japan. But I just think it's a fascinating piece of journalism because you get to see and hear from this man who tried to do this so many years ago.
We're out of time, but you've just got to tell us very briefly about these bored policemen in India.
It's about bringing your work with you on a little trip in your break time. 2 coppers turn up at the Taj Mahal with a prisoner in chains. They actually tried to leave him at the gate as they went round for a cup of tea and a walk around. The locals didn't like it. I'm not sure if that's because they saw it as threatening or they saw it as too much of an extension of bringing your work with you. But I just, visually, the picture is a phenomenal one of a guy in chains walking around with these policemen around this most this most famous of World Heritage sites.
Robin, thank you very much indeed. That's Robin Brandt there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Yesterday, US Vice President Kamala Harris pressured Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to help reach a Gaza ceasefire deal that would ease the suffering of Palestinian civilians, striking a tougher tone than President Joe Biden and raising the question of whether she would be more aggressive in dealing with Netanyahu if elected president on November the 5th. Biden met with Netanyahu earlier and told him he needed to close gaps to reach a ceasefire in Gaza and remove obstacles in the flow of aid. Mexican drug kingpin Ishmael El Mayo Zambada and the son of his ex-partner Joaquim El Chapo Guzman were arrested on Thursday in El Paso, Texas, in a major coup for US authorities that may also reshape the Mexican criminal landscape. In recent years, the Sinaloa cartel has become the biggest target for US authorities, who've accused the crime syndicate of being the biggest supplier of fentanyl to the United States. And on September the 21st, Sri Lanka will vote to elect a new president, a government notice said today, a crucial contest that's expected to determine the future of reforms in the South Asian island nation, weathering its worst financial crisis in decades. Incumbent President Ranil Wickremesinghe is widely expected to run in the election, with almost 17 million of Sri Lanka's 22 million population eligible to vote. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's 8:32 in Paris, 7:32 here in London. Now, the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics takes place this evening. Nearly 10,500 athletes from 206 delegations will parade down the Seine in front of several 100,000 people. Well, taking the temperature of the city and letting us know what we can expect from our team on the ground over the next fortnight is our Carlotta Rebello, who's Monocle's senior foreign correspondent. Good morning to you, Carlotta.
Good morning, Georgina.
I'm quite glad to hear that it has been raining in Paris because I was quite envious of you being there.
Well, your wish has been granted. It is raining this very second. And actually, that might not be a bad thing. You know, temperatures have been quite high. Humidity is at 88%. So the city feels like it needed the rain to try to bring the temperature down so that all these athletes can perform at their very best during the games.
What's the general mood there, Carlotta?
It really is a bit of a mix and match feeling in the city so far. There is a lot of security everywhere, not only in terms of people you see on the street, from the police officers. There are also police officers from different countries here as well to help with this extra security. But there's a lot of barriers and perimeters that have been set around the city. It's what they've been describing as the red zone and the grey zone. The closer you get to the River Seine, particularly today ahead of the opening ceremony, the more difficult it is for you to get through, and you need this pass that's issued by City Hall, to security pass, in order to even navigate around the riverbank. So there is a bit of apprehension around that and around the level of security. But at the same time, there is a real buzz in the city. You know, people are out and about. All the restaurants and cafes are full. There's seating by the canal waterfront that was all packed yesterday afternoon with people, and all of it decorated with the Olympics gear. Parks were also full of people having little picnics. So it is this mix and match feeling. And obviously, before the rain arrived, the weather was helping. But you do see people wearing Olympic kit everywhere. We went out to grab a quick bite as a team yesterday, and just next to us was a team of volunteers sitting just next to us. So you just see the display of this Olympic spirit everywhere.
And what do we expect from the opening ceremony today?
Yes, so all eyes today are set on the opening ceremony. It is quite a mammoth event. We're talking here about, up to 7,000 athletes out of the 10,500 that are competing. They represent 206 national delegations. 94 boats will travel along the 6-kilometer stretch of the River Seine. There's around 3,000 dancers as well, who listeners might know and might remember from earlier broadcasts that they were threatening to go on strike. Very French, but they are going ahead now with the performance. And it is a huge endeavor. And then, of course, you have all the world leaders as well. Le Parisien was reporting on who's attending. We know that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Zelensky won't be here, but instead will send other members of their delegation. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will be here, the Italian president, same for the Finnish and Greek prime ministers. The First Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden, will be here too. That's just to name a few. Then obviously other representatives from European royal families, from the British to the Spanish and many others. So it's not just about those taking part in the actual ceremony, but there's a lot of eyes on those watching from the riverbanks too.
Now, Carlotta, there's been a lot of talk about who the high-profile stars might be, who's performing, particularly who's going to sing La Vie en Rose.
Yes, of course, we know that the opening ceremony lineup has been probably Paris's best kept secret. But just yesterday, the French newspaper Le Parisien has given us a glimpse of the first artist. And yes, you're alluding there to the rumors that the superstar Celine Dion and Lady Gaga might be performing a duet. Now, these rumors started flying around because a piano was spotted on the water during rehearsals. And then coincidentally, both stars started posting about being in Paris. But what we know so far, according to Le Parisien, is that Aya Nakamura, which is one of France's most listened to singer, and our listeners might recognize her name and her works from our own global playlist. She'll be performing a Charles Aznavour classic, accompanied by the Republican Guard. And then Celine Dion will be serenading us with a song by Edith Piaf. And the rumors still continue that Lady Gaga will be gracing the Olympic stage. That's what we know so far. But it will be indeed a feast of French musical talent. Juliette Armanet, another regular on Monocle's playlist, will also be performing. So there's plenty to come later this evening. And it's not just us spectators who are excited. Even President Emmanuel Macron himself is looking forward to the opening ceremony.
Apparently she has arrived in Paris. It's great. I would be immensely happy if she could be at this opening ceremony, like all of our compatriots. I will not reveal anything, but there is also a surprise.
Well, that surprise might just be Celine Dion. We're not sure. Now, there's a full Monocle contingent there. You're going to be broadcasting from Paris for the next 2 weeks. Tell us more about what the plans are.
Yes, so Monocle Radio has truly decamped in the French capital. We'll be broadcasting from the Sceaux Hotel, which is close to the City Hall and to the Pavillon de l'Arsenal, which is the urbanism museum of the city. And the Sceaux Hotel, for the duration of the games, has been transformed in Maison Allianz. There's a lot of maisons scattered around the city, and this is where we'll be located. Now, we'll be airing 2 news shows every day, one immediately after the Globalist. So from next week, we'll have a double programming in the morning, and then the Monocle Daily with Andrew Mueller will be coming from Paris as well for the next 2 weeks. Plus, over the weekend, Monocle on Saturday and Monocle on Sunday, beginning this very Sunday, will also come from the city. In total, we're broadcasting 26 shows from here. It is a great opportunity for us to look at the games, not necessarily from the prism of just sports, but all the other things that hosting an Olympics mean. You know, what does it mean for the hospitality sector when the world's eyes are on you? What does it mean for the designers who had to create the logos, the statues, the medals, the torches, etc., etc., and of course the world of luxury, business, print, culture, you name it. So it will be a very fun couple of days hearing from all these different voices and a couple of the athletes, either who have competed in the past or that are competing this year. And we're really looking forward to it.
Carlotta, you mentioned security earlier, and we're getting some breaking news now about France's high-speed rail network.
Yes, so this has literally just happened. The warning has gone out that there's been a malicious attack. That's the quote that the transport minister has been using on the French high-speed network. Several high-speed TGV lines have been hit to the west, north and east of Paris, with queues reported at Gare Montparnasse here in Paris. They are saying that it might take up until the entire weekend while repairs are conducted. And this is a developing story. We'll know more as it happens. For now, it seems that the main consequence of this has been delays. A lot of trains have been delayed or suspended or cancelled as security officials and transport officials try to understand the severity of the situation. So we'll be, of course, updating you throughout the day on the story as it develops.
Carlotta Rebella in Paris. This is The Globalist. It's Friday, so here's Andrew Mueller with What We Learned.
We learned this week that US President Joe Biden, having reflected long and hard on an increasingly hostile political landscape and decreasingly encouraging polling ahead of November's presidential election, had resolved to keep his powder dry for 2028.
I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy.
We learned that, instead, American voters would be asked for the second time in the history of their republic if they could possibly cope with the idea of a woman in charge, specifically current Vice President, former California Senator Kamala Harris, perhaps hitherto best known as the only person on Earth capable of making the right-thinking citizen feel even gladder than usual that they are not weirdo Trump-era Supreme Court appointee Brett Kavanaugh.
I'll repeat the question. Can you think of any laws that give the government the power to make decisions about the male body?
I'm not thinking of any right now, Senator.
Nor weirdo Trump-era Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
Somebody sir, I have just a few.
Well, you let me qualify it. If I don't qualify it, you'll accuse me of lying. So I need to be correct as best I can.
I do want you to be honest.
And I'm not able to be rushed this fast. It makes me nervous.
And
conservative Christian, right-wing Republican, straight white American male.
We learned once Harris's elevation to the top of the Democratic ticket was all but confirmed that for some scarcely imaginable reason at which we could not begin to guess, a cohort of angry white guys were especially vexed by the spectre of an Indian-Jamaican woman offering to run the country. Honestly, where will it end? They'll be wanting to vote next. Among them, Republican vice presidential nominee Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, who almost inventively lit upon still another reason to be appalled by this gruesome prospect.
And it's just a basic fact. You look at Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, AOC, the entire future of the Democrats is controlled by people without children. And how does it make any sense that we've turned our country over to people who don't really have a direct stake in it?
Leaving aside the fact that Kamala Harris does have children, i.e. stepchildren, of whom we can probably assume she's reasonably fond and in whose future she may well take a passing interest, and that Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is a father of two, because we're pretty sure adopted kids count, and that Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez may or may not yet have children, and really it's none of anybody's goddamn business, there now follows a complete list of US presidents from the American Revolution to the present day who have given birth. Fun fact, George Washington, father of the nation, was not, in fact, technically the father of any children, though was stepfather to 2, as his wife had been married previously. What a freak. Returning while we still can to the subject of J.D. Vance, however... We did not, if we're honest, learn whether there was any truth to the rumours that Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump was already wearying of his recently anointed mini-me, but we are choosing to believe them because it amuses us so to do, which we think is fair enough. Can we have some general muttered agreement?
I think so.
For we learned that if Trump is rethinking his Veep pick, he may have good reason, as we learned that Vance is arguably not, it turns out, a natural rouser of rabble.
It is the weirdest thing to me. Democrats say that it is racist to believe, well, they say it's racist to do anything. I had a Diet Mountain Dew yesterday and one today. I'm sure they're going to call that racist too, but it's good. I love you guys.
Wouldn't open with it. We still have that clip of howling wind, crickets and hooting owls, right? We learned that among those unimpressed with Vance's or shucks down-home Appalachian goober shtick is one contender for the now open vice president spot on the Democratic ticket, specifically Andy Beshear, governor of Kentucky, the state which was substantially the undeserving setting of Vance's tedious memoir, Hillbilly Elegy.
He ain't from here. He is not from Kentucky. Listen, this is a guy who would come maybe in the summers for some period of time, or to weddings or funerals, and then he claims to be from Eastern Kentucky, tries to write a book about it to profit off our people, and then he calls us lazy.
From which we learned that Governor Beshear is unlikely to blurb any future editions of Vance's dreary book, which we grant may improve after the first 50 turgid pages, but we, for one whimsical news monologue, will never know. But as the Democrats' Veep stakes got underway, we learned, as we usually do, that the potential actual contenders, such as Governor Beshear, were obdurately coy about their prospects, while those who understood that they haven't a hope were just delighted for the chance to join in. Among them, Jared Polis, Governor of Colorado.
Look, if they do the polling and it turns out that they need a 49-year-old balding gay Jew from Boulder, Colorado, they got my number.
But we learned that Trump's conservative media cheerleaders had found the most authoritative imaginable sage to articulate reservations about the new Democratic standard bearer as a desperate, unqualified stopgap. Are there any songs about exulting in lettuce?
Love letters from...
Near enough.
She is not delivered as vice president, and she's got the job now because of the crazy situation with President Biden retiring at the last minute, even though everybody in America knew that he was not up to the job.
So we learned that Kamala Harris only arrived at her present position in bizarre circumstances because her predecessor wasn't up to it and was incapable of delivering. Thank you, Liz Truss, for your input. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller.
Thank you, Andrew. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's time now to talk aviation with Sally Gethin, who is an aviation analyst and joins me in the studio now. Good morning to you, Sally.
Morning.
Now, this global IT outage, one of the industries that it really hammered, of course, was travel, particularly air travel. Tell us more about that. Has it been resolved completely?
Yes, it absolutely did affect air travel. In fact, if you recall, just a short 7 days ago, news was trickling in of completely blank screens at airports and flights being cancelled left, right and centre. And it wasn't just in one particular region, it was across the world. And it's taken the best part of a week for the airlines to be able to come back to normal. And the United States was particularly badly affected. Delta Airlines in particular struggling up until a few days ago. And what happened? So all we know is that there was this so-called outage by a company called CrowdStrike, but it affected a base operating system at airports and airlines around the world who rely on that particular technology. And so it had this ripple effect. And once certain flights were grounded, it created a knock-on effect of delays to departures and arrivals. And of course, with large international hub carrier airlines, that has a ripple effect through their entire networks.
Let's move on to the Farnborough Air Show. I'm assuming you've been.
Yes.
Tell us about some of the commercial aeroplane orders.
Yes, so very, very interesting. Obviously, the two giants, Airbus and Boeing, were there, although Boeing didn't bring any of its own airplanes to the flying display this time around. It's hunkering down in the face of a major crisis with a lot of legal action it's facing and so forth. But it's still scored some good orders with Qatar Airways and a number of airlines for its wide-body aircraft, particularly the 777X and the 787. And Airbus also did extremely well, scoring a major order to Virgin Atlantic and also yesterday a last-minute one to Flynas, a Saudi-based airline. And in fact, Airbus pipped Boeing to the post in the end with 139 airplane orders across the week compared to Boeing's 118. So the competition there continues. But very exciting news with the A321 XLR, which is a new plane which will be a route opener in long-haul destinations. So we could see travelling in single-aisle airplanes for very long distances, intercontinental, but at lower airfares in the future with this particular new airplane type from Airbus.
And that's very exciting. What about things like sustainability? I mean, I know that that's a key theme of Farnborough this year.
Absolutely was. An absolute key theme. It's really risen to the top of the agenda. In fact, without sustainability, the whole of the aerospace and aviation sector can't move forward. We saw various prototypes for what's called EVTOL, electrical vehicle takeoff and landing vehicles, advanced air mobility, which is, for example, ranging from drones up to electrical air taxis. But of course, the big aim is to make large passenger aircraft sustainable. In the short to medium term, we're looking at sustainable aviation fuel, biofuels, and there is a race to increase production of those around the world, particularly in the United States and Europe, but also other technologies like hydrogen fuel cell technology as well. There's a lot of ambition, a lot of work, a lot of interesting tech on display at the show this year.
Finally, Sally, the Olympics, of course, the opening ceremony tonight, and huge amounts of people flooding into the city. How is that affecting air traffic?
Yes, an estimated 15 million visitors will have arrived or are arriving into Paris. There's an unprecedented closure of the airspace over Paris starting from this evening in anticipation of the ceremony. This is for security reasons. So the whole of the airspace over Paris and beyond is closed. That will affect some flights outside, not necessarily going to Paris. So there's that to bear in mind. And also there's some rumoured strikes, industrial action at the French airports, Paris, Charles de Gaulle and Orly as well, although that is literally, it's actually unravelling, evolving. We don't know yet if that's definitely taking place. But there are still flights to be had after the ceremony for those who are desperate to get out to Paris and see the games. So, very busy in terms of travel.
And why are they striking? Why might they strike?
I think it's over pay and just, using the opportunity of the such a major event to be able to force the arm of the employers at the airports.
Can you imagine the chaos if that happens?
It's estimated to be, however, sort of just a specific amount of a flight. So it's hoped that it won't have a massive impact during the course of the day. There's been a lot of negotiations to try and avoid it actually making a disastrous impact.
And when you have a big event like this, do airlines then put on extra flights, or is Orly and Charles de Gaulle already at capacity?
Yes, definitely. There will be efforts to make sure that every slot is used. But you're right also, these are major, especially Paris Charles de Gaulle, and it's an international hub for connecting traffic as well. So obviously there are some constraints there with the amount of flights they can increase. They can completely build on to add for the games.
Sally, thank you very much indeed. That's Sally Gethin there. And actually we'll stick with aviation to finish the show. In Brazil, the Ministry of Ports and Airports has launched an exciting new initiative offering retirees airline tickets for around €35 each way. After some delays, the VOA Brazil programme is now live with 3 million tickets available. That's below the original target, but still a significant start. Monocle's head of radio, Tom Edwards, sat down with our resident Brazilian, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, and to talk about the initiative. And Tom began by asking Fernando what it's all about.
VOA Brasil, or Fly Brazil, is the first social inclusion civil aviation program from the government. And what does that mean is, so basically the government and the airlines, it was kind of a partnership. So it wasn't necessarily subsidized by the federal government, but clearly they work together with the airlines. So there'll be 3 million tickets for domestic flights that will be available for retirees in Brazil. So we have 23 million of them. And the reality is, Tom, 95% of them, they earn up to 2 minimum wages. So, they don't have the purchasing power. And in Brazil, actually, to fly, it is expensive for many if you look into it. So they are using those tickets because they did some research. Apparently 20% of all seats in Brazil, they were idle. They were not being used. So, of course, people can go online or they can, apply for it. And then they say, you know what, I have a ticket there, and they can go to the destination they want. And the government wants to expand this program as well. So it's not just going to be retirees. So people, there are students that are in public universities or public schools as well. So people that are struggling a little bit in life. So it's quite a nice incentive for them to fly as well.
Look, this seems a clever idea, Fernando. There's lots of spare capacity on airlines. There are groups, older people, students, people on lower incomes who not only disincentivised to travel, they probably just literally can't afford it. And here we have a thing that joins up this availability with this need. It sounds like a recipe for success. Do you think it will work? How hard is it generally for Brazilians to fly around? And do you think if it does work, they might roll it out to maybe include some other groups too?
They might do. So our Minister for Ports and Airports, Silvio Costa Filho, they said initially it would be 3 million tickets. But if this gets sold out, there might be a potential to release more tickets as well. And Tom, it is a bit of a struggle to fly, to travel in Brazil in general. We do not have trains, basically. I mean, they're in existence. There are a few of them that I can count. So people sometimes they have to go on very long bus journeys. I mean, that sometimes take days. Or, of course, driving with their own cars. So I think it's great that people from those groups, they can fly as well. And I have to say, Tom, even when I go to Brazil and I go to Rio, Yes, sometimes I buy a ticket, but they can be expensive, even if you're buying a bit last minute. I mean, compare here to Europe, where you can go to any of the big cities. It feels quite cheap to me. And it's funny because, of course, people in Brazil, they earn less. So I think, as I said, I think it's quite a necessity for many people, especially because in Brazil itself, sometimes you're from São Paulo, but you have family living in the northeast or in the south of the country. There are a lot of that. Families, as in any other country, right? But people live in different places as well.
Fernando, let's just talk, if we zoom out a little bit, aviation. We've often talked about airports, we talked about inbound and outbound travel, the domestic market. Brazil is a super interesting market, not just I mentioned helicopters at the top, of course, but they're building a lot of aircraft. They've got one of the world's biggest manufacturers there. What are some of the challenges? I guess many of the attendant challenges for Brazilian operators, airframe makers, whatever, are kind of the same as those besetting people who are doing that in any other part of the world as well.
I will expand a little bit on that story, Tom. I think one of the challenges as well, I do think we need more competition. In Brazil, we don't have what we see in Europe, the low-cost airlines. In Brazil, you have the big groups. You have, of course, Latam, you have Gol and Azul. They're doing very well at the moment. But we need more of those, so the prices will become a little bit more competitive as well. Because as you rightly said, we do manufacture planes. Embraer, the third largest in the world. There is potential. There's been growth in the domestic market in terms of passengers. I believe there was a rise of 10% in the last year. But I think there's space for more as well. I know there's been some investment in our airports. They are better than they used to be a decade or 2 decades ago. But yeah, there's a few challenges there.
Just to go back to where we started, we talked about trying to get retirees, older people, silver surfers, whatever you want to call them, to fly. To generalise, Fernando, if you're a retiree, maybe you've not taken to the air for a long time, you're going to take advantage of this initiative. Let's say you're Carioca. You're in Rio. You're going to get on one of these flights. Where should they go, Fernando, and why?
Maybe you don't necessarily need to see your grandkids, Maybe you had enough of them. So why don't you go to Bahia? Why don't you go the south coast of Bahia? It is just incredible selection of cities. Probably you can fly to the city of Porto Seguro. You don't need to stay in Porto Seguro, by the way, but you can travel around. I think that's my tip of the day.
Well, let's hope that initiative takes flight. That was Fernando Augusto Pacheco in conversation with Tom Edwards. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Laura Kramer, Angelica Jobson, our researcher, Sana Jamani, and our studio manager, Steph Chungu. There's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday at noon London time. The Globalist will return at the same time on Monday. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.